Denial, they say, ain't just a river in Egypt. I recently read that the mind does not follow the facts, that confirmation bias, which we all have, causes us to ignore evidence that challenges or contradicts our beliefs. And as a result, it's nearly impossible to convince someone of something that she does not want to hear. So the likelihood is that hearing a sermon that challenges our views will not change our minds, even if we're here because on some level we yearn for change in our lives and in the world. There's a story in the Talmud about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wrestling with whether or not he should speak publicly about a particularly fraught communal issue. Oy li im omar, he said, v'oy li im lo omar. Woe unto me if I speak, and woe unto me if I stay silent. This is the origin of oy vey. He chose to speak, and I will too, in the hopes that I've earned enough goodwill over the past 10 days, and hopefully over the past many years that you know my heart and my intentions. And woe unto me if I anger my hungry congregation today. So I'm going to start with the easy stuff. Maybe you saw the video of an 11-year-old girl from Colorado Springs who stood up at her senator's town hall in August, begging him to initiate a climate solutions caucus in the Senate. To her senator, who was a well-known climate denier, she said the following: "You have to act now. If the carbon polluter's money is holding you back, I can organize kids and adults to raise money for you. We can use social media and grassroots. If all you need is more information, I can come visit the Energy Committee and do a PowerPoint for you and your friends." Around the same time, at a town hall in Utah, for a congressman, a 10-year-old girl stood up from Salt Lake City and said, "Do you believe in science? Because I do." We know that there is an absurdity to national policy being shaped based on a resistance to empirical fact. It is farcical that children have to stand up to remind grown-ups, especially those charged with creating legislation to protect this nation and its people, that science is real. And yet, our country's stubborn dependence on fossil fuels has led to a kind of fierce denialism that has quashed the national climate conversation over the past many decades. This despite the freak weather patterns that are now affecting us daily, hurricanes and droughts and wildfires, and despite the overwhelming scientific consensus that climate warming trends over the past century are clearly due to human activities. And we know that it's going to get worse, with climate scientists warning us that record-breaking global temperatures and a stunning decline in sea ice will cause catastrophic changes to the Earth's ecosystems and will wreak havoc on human populations, including famine, mass migration, and war. We also know that developing countries, low-income communities, and communities of color will feel the effects of climate change disproportionately. So if the scientific consensus is clear, and the danger of inaction is calamity, so why do we see senators and representatives so insistent on ignoring reality that they will stumble over their own 2 feet to frantically exit stage left when elementary school students confront them with the truth? Why is it, when the outcome is nothing short of catastrophic, that we insist on playing political football with this issue? And speaking of football, I know you love your football. And as of last Sunday, I now officially consider myself a football fan as well. And I have been warned by many of you, including some of my closest friends and relatives, never to speak about the prevalence in football players of brain damage that is linked to repeated blows to the head, what's known as CTE, because people really don't want to hear about this. But the fact that we don't want to hear about it does not mean that it's not happening. A neuropathologist recently examined the brains of 202 deceased football players. She found CTE in all but one of them who played in the NFL. This is no joke. CTE is a degenerative disease that causes memory loss and depression and dementia that often leads to overdoses of pain medication and even suicide. Yet for years, as the evidence has accumulated that former players are exhibiting signs of brain damage, the NFL and its advertisers and many fans remain in active denial. The truth is, it's easy for me to stand up here and speak to the Jewish community about climate change. We tend to have a healthy respect for science. It's a little bit harder to talk about football, and now even harder than before, when NFL players are literally standing on the front lines of the battle for racial justice in our country right now. But today is the day for the hardest conversations, is it not? After all, isn't that the challenge of Yom Kippur? That we press pause on our lives one day a year, and we do the critical work. We look at the hard edges in order to see where the healing might come and from where we can draw hope. So can we not also acknowledge today, because it's Yom Kippur, and this is what we're here to do, that that very same self-destructive denialism is now also permeating the Jewish public and political discourse on Israel? Oy li im omar, oy li im lo omar. Woe unto me if I speak, and woe unto me if I stay silent. Don't leave the room, please. This conversation is always hard, and it's harder than usual this week after 3 Israelis were killed in a terrorist attack. My heart is with their grieving families who enter Yom Kippur this year bereft of their loved one. And my heart is also with my many Israeli friends and family, some of whom are here today, who are kind and soulful and wise and patient people who work and fight every single day to bring more love and more light into the world. And I suspect it's probably because of my deep love for Israel and its people that I really don't want to talk about this right now. I would much rather talk about climate change or even football. Or if we're talking about Israel, I would love to talk to you about the work of Israel, the real Israeli heroes, Jewish and Arab, who put themselves in grave danger to bring desperately needed humanitarian aid to the hardest hit regions in the world. We met with their director just a couple of weeks ago when he spoke in our community on Shabbat. I would love to talk to you about Save a Child's Heart and about pluralistic yeshivot dotting the landscape in Israel, and about the many extraordinary NGOs that are working to transform Israeli society. I would love to talk to you about the Jerusalem Shuk at night, and about the Tachana, and about the Techina, and about Startup Nation, and about breathtaking Israeli advances in science and technology and medicine. And I hope and pray that next year on Yom Kippur, I will be able to do just that. But this year, we are 50 years from 1967, and I am worried sick for Israel's soul and its future, and I could see no way to avoid this conversation today. So how has denialism shaped our Jewish communal discourse on Israel? In 2003, something stunning happened. Ariel Sharon, who was the hawkish prime minister of Israel, said the following: "You may not like the word, but what's happening here is kibush, occupation. To hold several million Palestinians under occupation, I believe that is a terrible thing for Israel and for the Palestinians." Now, after 36 years of occupation, it was Ariel Sharon, of all people, who finally insisted that we as a Jewish people needed to speak honestly and unflinchingly about the reality of life under the occupation, some of which I witnessed firsthand this summer when I went on an encounter trip, a 4-day intensive, to the Palestinian territories with American Jewish leaders. These were educators and organizational heads and rabbis, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. The goal of this trip was simply to give us an opportunity to hear from Palestinians, and to be exposed to the reality of their lives. This was a challenging and in many ways a painful trip for many of us, as we saw how the occupation that Sharon was warning us about continues to affect nearly every aspect of the daily lives of Palestinians, from access to water, to the rights of citizenship. They do not vote in Israeli elections, to the fact that they often can't get from one Palestinian city to another without crossing through Israeli checkpoints, which can range from a nuisance to a profound humiliation depending on the day. For Palestinians living in East Jerusalem and other areas under Israeli control, we heard about how they can't get permits to build onto their homes. And when they do it without permits, because their families have grown, those homes are often demolished. And sometimes, like what happened just a couple of weeks ago, Palestinian schools are demolished just days before the school year is to begin. We're all well versed, I think, in the justifications for this reality. There are real security concerns evidenced by the ongoing threat of terror. And we know about the failure of the Palestinian leadership to accept a peace deal when Israel has repeatedly attempted to achieve one. There's truth to both of these arguments. But the fact is, it's not the whole truth. The thing that we don't like to admit, the heart of our denial, is that beyond real security concerns and beyond failed peace efforts, it is the settlement enterprise that is the driving force of the reality in the West Bank. There are now hundreds of thousands of Jewish Israelis who live in that territory, and they have full rights of Israeli citizenship. They live among 2.3 million Palestinians who do not share those rights. These settlements are supported by a right-wing ultranationalist government and an extensive infrastructure, what some people call a matrix of control, that has been established to preserve and to expand their presence. This effort is fueled by messianic and nationalistic aspirations, which are shared neither by the majority of Israelis or the overwhelming majority of diaspora Jews. So the question I want us to struggle with today is, what ought we, American Jews, do when Israel's right-wing ultra-nationalist government pursues policies based on aspirations that we do not share and values that we simply cannot abide? Today, a decade and a half after Sharon's declaration, those who talk about it, those who are troubled by the dissonance between our Jewish values of human dignity and justice and compassion and the actions of Israel's right-wing government, are lambasted and shamed and threatened and sometimes fired. Woe unto us if we talk about what appears in plain sight to anybody who cares to take a look. One Orthodox rabbi, after a recent trip to Hebron, said that his challenge now was to figure out how to return to his congregation and talk about the occupation without actually mentioning the occupation. Our American Jewish community is wedded to a denialist script, and anyone who breaches the established protocol, even if she speaks from a desperate love and concern for Israel, is marked as a traitor and an enemy of the state. Blood on your hands, they say. Capo whore, Judenrat, all of which I have been called in the past 48 hours. Thank you very much. This has been evidenced most recently by the witch hunt against Professor David Myers, who's been accused of being a radical anti-Israel leftist despite his many years of dedication to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, and despite his opposition to BDS, to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. As Yehuda Kurtzer wrote last year, our community is ailing, and its primary symptom is a toxic shock resulting from the ongoing vilifying of the best of our leaders with accusations of insufficient loyalty to the Jewish people, based on crude interpretations of their politics. It's when you realize that it is as treacherous for a Jewish leader to speak publicly against the occupation as it is for a Republican presidential candidate to broach greenhouse gas emissions that you see that the occupation is the Jewish climate change. This is our CTE. I find it strange in a community that so prides itself on debate and dissent that ideas like human dignity and equality are considered so threatening. I find it strange that a community that holds tochecha, loving rebuke, as a central and affirmative obligation would so mercilessly savage its justices, its journalists, its rabbis and academics and activists who challenge or even question the ultra-nationalist agenda. Is that who we are as a people today? I understand. I really understand. We don't want to say anything that might jeopardize or endanger Israel, especially when ISIS is on the border and Iran remains a serious threat. We don't want to add fuel to the fire of those who are predisposed to hate our beloved Israel, who single Israel out for opprobrium on the world stage, who treat Israel like a rogue state, irredeemable and illegitimate, all while ignoring gross abuses of human rights from other state actors. But when we remove ourselves from honest, self-reflective assessment of Israeli policy, compounded over decades, and we instead only react with defensive outrage to each and every criticism, we are creating a dangerous and potentially destructive vacuum in which the conversation is framed only by the most extreme voices. One of the folks that we heard from on our encounter program was a Palestinian-American businessman named Sam Bahor. He moved from Ohio to Ramallah years ago, and he built a large and successful telecommunications company there. He shared with us the daily challenges of Palestinian life, including the fact that his U.S. passport was invalidated by Israeli authorities. And he talked about suffering indignities like walking through the Kalandia checkpoint every time he has a business meeting in Jerusalem. As we were leaving, someone asked Sam what we can do to help. Be Jewish, he said. Don't leave your Jewish hearts on the plane when you land at Ben Gurion Airport. I can't get that line out of my head. After 2,000 years of profound collective, psyche-shaping trauma, Zionism was a chance for Jews to reclaim our humanity and our agency. The Zionist dream was to build a strong and secure Jewish state in which a Jew could defend himself and his family and be Jewish, live out his Jewish values on a public stage. And we've gotten so much right over these 70 years. But whether we talk about it out loud or not, the current reality, which is the result of many years of Israeli policy, is antithetical to the core teachings of our tradition and, frankly, irreconcilable both with our Judaism and with our Zionism. Denialism is as pervasive as it is pernicious. And while it's terribly hard for us to talk about and hear about systemic failures in Israel or in the United States like we did on Rosh Hashanah, there is something that is even more personal and even more painful. And that's the denialism that permeates our homes and sometimes tears at the very fabric of our families. We talk a lot on Yom Kippur about our culture's most prevalent form of denial, the denial of death. The way that we develop elaborate mechanisms to avoid thinking about how close we and our loved ones may actually be to the end. The way that we fill our lives with trivialities, with inconsequential conflicts and irrelevant distractions, as if we'll live forever. And we do this with illness too, papering over family members' addictions or our own, eating disorders, mental illness, desperately trying to avoid what we know is happening. This is generally driven by fear, vulnerability, and love. Some things are just too painful to confront. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen tells a story of a patient she had when she was a first-year doctor. It was a 15-year-old girl named Gloria, and she had terminal leukemia. The hospital policy at that time was not to discuss either illness or prognosis with a patient without the parent's permission. And while Gloria was clearly dying, her parents were emphatic that she not be told. Without her parents' permission, while Gloria her condition was worsening, The door of honest communication had been sealed shut. I want to be clear. I believe her parents did this for all the right reasons. Her parents didn't want her to suffer more, to live out her final days in terror, to feel psychic pain on top of her physical pain. A wall of silence emerged between patient and doctor as Dr. Remen cared for Gloria but avoided speaking to her for fear of violating the protocol, until one night when Gloria asked point blank, "Dr. Remen, am I dying?" When I reached for the professional words of denial, Dr. Remen wrote years later, they just wouldn't come. So instead, she explained that they were doing everything they could, but if the disease continued to grow, she might die, yes. Gloria closed her eyes, and she said she already knew it, but she didn't want to tell her parents because she knew that they couldn't bear it. She then began to feverishly engage Dr. Remen with endless questions about death and dying. Will it hurt? Could life go on after death? And finally, weeks later, when it was clear that Gloria was in her last days, Dr. Remen encouraged her to talk to her parents. She was all the while afraid that she was going to get fired for violating hospital protocol. But Gloria spoke with her parents, and they cried, and they laughed, and they planned her funeral. And after she breathed her last breath, with all of them standing by her side, Gloria's parents turned to Dr. Remen and simply said, "Thank you. Oy lanu im omrim, oy lanu im lo omrim, woe unto us if we speak, and woe unto us if we stay silent." In a recent episode of Hidden Brain, they explored a form of denialism called information aversion, or the ostrich effect. There's this old theory in economics that you should always be willing to learn as much as possible, particularly about your finances or your health. They say less is never more when it comes to information. And yet, study after study shows that when people perceive that information will be anxiety-provoking or depressing, we will go out of our way not to hear it. It's called the ostrich effect because we'd rather put our heads in the sand than confront these uncomfortable truths. And the ostrich effect can actually be deadly. On college campuses, researchers found that a significant percentage of students actually paid money to not receive the results of their herpes tests because they simply did not want to know. As counterintuitive as it is, another study found that when a woman is diagnosed with breast cancer, this dramatically reduces the likelihood that her female coworkers will get mammograms for the next 1 to 2 years, because our brains are hardwired to avoid information that is painful or scary. So we actively shut out what we do not want to hear. I believe this is why Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai struggled so much to determine if he should speak or stay silent. He knew the people couldn't hear him anyway. They had a brain block against taking in what they didn't want to hear. So why bother? It will only make them angry at you. It may even feed their enemies, those who are always looking for a way to harm the community. I can so relate to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's reticence. Denial is the unrealistic hope that a problem isn't really happening, or that if we ignore it, it will go away on its own. But while denial may distract us, and it may divert our attention, it does not stop the icebergs from melting. It does not stop the settlements from expanding, and it doesn't magically make our loved one well. It doesn't actually make the problem go away. It only leaves us ill-equipped to address it honestly and lovingly and proactively. Maybe that's why it's so painfully ironic that it's often the most strident supporters, those with the most to lose, who are those that are the most guilty of denialism. It is, after all, elected officials from states like Florida and Texas, whose cities were underwater this past month, who are the least willing to admit, let alone take political action to address climate change. It is the most passionate fans of football who struggle to acknowledge let alone demand action to reduce the risk of their sport to their beloved athletes on the field, it is often the proudest and most ardent supporters of Israel who are the least likely to talk about the devastating impact of many years of anti-democratic and frankly un-Jewish policy in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. And of course, in our own families, we engage in the denialist acrobatics, not out of cruelty and not out of ignorance, but to protect the people that we love most from the hurt and the shame and the pain that we feel that they will suffer were we to face the truth. Call it the perils of loving something too much. The turning point in Moses' life was when he grew up and he went out of the palace to his brethren, the enslaved Israelites. He must have known, I imagine, what was going on just beyond those palace gates. He must have known it his whole childhood. He must have heard the cries of those slaves and on some level witnessed their suffering, but he was in denial. He did not want to know what was happening because recognizing the cruelty of slavery would make literally everyone he loved complicit. His Egyptian mother, Pharaoh, who had shown him so much kindness, the whole Egyptian court, he himself would be implicated. So he simply couldn't see it until he grew up and he went out. And then he saw. And here the verb to see is repeated, Vayar besivlotam, Vayar ish mitzri. First he sees the Israelites suffer, and then he sees again, this time witnessing an Egyptian strike down a Hebrew brother. The first act of seeing opens his eyes. The second opens his heart. And it's then that he can no longer deny it. That is the moment that changes everything. That realization for Moses is excruciating, but it also saves his life. And it also leads to the redemption of the Israelite people. Because you see, there is another way. There is a way of wakefulness and honesty and compassion. It requires a willingness to expose the vulnerabilities and to fight through the discomfort and the shame. It also demands that we give up some of the righteousness that often comes with the victim narratives that feed our denial. This requires a willingness to see with our own eyes and then with our hearts at precisely the moment that we want to put up a giant protective wall around our hearts. It's entirely counterinstinctual and it's often very painful, but I know that it offers us a way forward. So because the Jewish community's denialism around Israel-Palestine is so deeply rooted, and because the stakes are so high, and this conflict seems so impenetrable, I want to close today by sharing a story of someone who was able to break through the denial, to see with her eyes and then with her heart, until she could ultimately begin to engage differently. My friend Yakir Englander is a professor of philosophy who came to speak at Ikar in the spring. He grew up in a Hasidic Israeli family. His mother is the daughter of Holocaust survivors. His grandparents were forced to watch as Nazis murdered their parents and their newborn son. And even after the war, his grandmother never once hung laundry because the images evoked her parents hanging. And even many, many years later, she never once hugged her own children. As a teenager, Yakir left the Hasidic world. To his family's consternation, he became interested in interfaith dialogue and nonviolent social change. He writes about one life-changing experience that had occurred a few years ago when he was receiving an award for his work with Kids for Peace. His Hasidic Israeli parents surprisingly decided to attend his award ceremony. Not unexpectedly, Yakir remembers, they sat on the other side of the hall from where my Palestinian friends sat. In my talk, he said, I spoke about how my Hasidic theology helps me in my peace work. My parents were so excited to hear that everything I do is because of them, that at the end of the ceremony, my mom came to say hello to my Palestinian friends, my other family. One of our directors, a Muslim woman wearing hijab, hugged my mom. I saw my mother's face become totally white. since subconsciously she was sure that this Muslim woman was about to put a knife in her back. When she saw that all she got was a warm hug, she had tears. Remember, she was never hugged by her own mother. This Muslim woman told my mom that I am like a brother to her, and my mother replied that this means that she, the Palestinian Muslim lady, is also her child. Several months later at Shabbat dinner with his family, one of Yakir's relatives begins ranting about dirty Arabs, and Yakir watches in amazement as his mother stood up and pounded the table and shouted, "How dare you? Don't you believe that they too have the image of God? Did you ever speak with the Palestinians? I hugged them with my own body and saw how many lies I was told my entire life." Since that night, Yakir says, no one can speak even one bad word against Palestinians or Muslims in my family. I am afraid that in our silence, that in our denialism, American Jews have become complicit in the erosion and undermining of the Israel we love and the Jewish values that we hold dear. That we have failed to advance critical, even life-saving conversations, and instead, like ostriches, we have tried to will away the reality. I don't blame us for the denialism. We did it for love. But I believe that that same love is strong enough to help us face the truth. I hope that this year we will find the courage to talk about it, even with people who don't want to hear what we have to say. I hope that we will affirm with love and conviction that only when we honestly confront the real challenges, only when we open our eyes and our hearts, will we be able to see what we could not see before. I pray that our love will guide us as we work to create new paradigms of possibility for ourselves, for our families, for Israel, for this country, and for the world this year. Gamar Tov.